Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. Welcome to my home studio. We've done a few of these videos in the past where I've given tours of my home studio, and this studio is a little different than some of the other ones that I've had, and so I think it's going to be something that many people can relate to. So let's take a look around and see what's happening here. So I've told the story before, but my wife and I are serial renovators. This is actually the 8th place we've lived in the last 14 years or so. We'll buy a place, we'll work on it, we'll upgrade it, we'll renovate it, and then we'll live there for a while and move on to someplace else. So we've been in this house for just about a year now. One of the things that I loved about this house was, first of all, it's got great views outside. But second of all, there was this room that's, I think it's about 14 feet, almost 14 feet square, got about an 8.5 foot ceiling on it. And so it's a nice size for a home studio. Not too big, not too small. It's kind of isolated from the rest of the house, so I'm not bothering anybody down here from making a little bit of noise. But it basically was a box with 6 hard surfaces. In fact, the floor is tile, so there's very hard surfaces, and it was a rattle trap. So I had my friend Gavin Haverstick from Haverstick Designs come over. He's an acoustician, so accomplished and such a great studio designer. And he came over and took a look at the room, and we started working on a plan. So we are here with Gavin Haverstick, Haverstick Designs. Great to have you here.
Hey, good to see you again, Mitch.
And a real acoustician.
In
the real
flesh,
thing.
in the flesh, yeah.
So we're in a well-treated room.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, I don't even know I'm here. Like, I mean, you've got it covered.
So it's a bedroom. It's in the basement of the house, and it has a tile floor, which is kind of interesting, but it's roughly 15 feet square.
Yeah.
Not quite, but pretty close.
Yeah, it's about 4 or 5 inches off as far as each dimension goes.
Right, which is not ideal, right?
Yeah, usually you want to avoid dimensions that are divisible by the same number or each other. Just makes your frequency response issues a little bit more problematic, but
right.
At least there is some variance. So,
right.
Yeah.
So when you come into a room like this, what's your process?
First thing is just get physical measurements of the room, because I wanted to make sure that I had enough information to do a computer model of the space. And so I went around and measured every detail. I probably go overboard with that because I'm going to drop that into AutoCAD and also SketchUp to be able to do some renderings of what the space might look like after the fact. So measured the windows, doors, outlets, switches, lights on the ceiling, all that to be able to get the good information to make sure that when we specify something for you, there's not an obstacle in the way that doesn't allow you to do it.
So that's kind of the physical aspects of it, the big window and 2 doors and the other small things. But you were also making some noise in here.
I was doing some frequency sweeps. And we first spent quite a bit of time getting the equilateral triangle right with your speakers. And we started off with your mix position being at the 38% point of the length of the room, which is usually the best place to put your listening position as far as having the least amount of problems modally in the space. So 38% of the length of the room, we set the microphone up there, and then we set our equilateral triangle with the speakers based off of that. Trying to preserve the amazing view that you have out the window is one thing, but also just getting that dialed in so that you're sitting equidistant from each speaker.
And so the result of those sweeps is you measure that, I'm assuming, with some software, hardware?
Yeah, we used Fuzz Measure, which is distributed by Rode, and it's a great program to use because you can very quickly overlay different tests that you just did. Like, for instance, I measured both speakers active at the same time, and then the left speaker isolated by itself, right speaker isolated by itself, and I can overlay those very quickly to be able to see what frequency issues might be driven more from the left or the right. This room is really symmetrical, so there really isn't a whole lot of variance between left and right because we've set it up perfectly symmetrical in the room. If we're looking at the frequency response of the room, this is with both speakers engaged, and honestly with the left and right, it's very similar since it is a symmetrical room. At least the shaping of it is very similar, and so the blue and the green, blue is left, green is right, and you can see it follows the same pattern as both speakers engaged, which is what you want to see. We test rooms all the time where you overlay the left and the right speaker and it looks like totally two different rooms. This is really beneficial to have a symmetrical room. Here we have some peaks and dips. Obviously it's an untreated space. The first one here that you see happens to be right at about 40 hertz. And that one, from our quick modal analysis that we did, we're going to dig into it a little bit further. It looks to be a front to back axial mode that's causing that. We also have a dip that's happening around 56, and that is mostly due to a tangential mode that is distributed around the four walls, so that vertical corner trapping is what's going to help us with this. There's also a peak that is happening here at this frequency, which happens to be around 72, and that is a side-to-side axial mode. The fact that we want to sit in the center of the room for symmetry reasons works against us in this case, because we're sitting at a place where it's a buildup of energy for that side-to-side axial mode. Other than that, there's some peaks and dips here, but it's really not too bad. Then you get into the comb filtering that's happening in the higher frequencies here. You see all these sharp peaks and dips in the frequency response. It looks like the teeth of a comb, and that's why it gets its name, but it's basically a phase cancellation, because you have direct sound hitting the microphone, and then all these reflections that are happening over time. Speaking of that, if we go down to our impulse response here, at this peak that's happening here, this is the x-axis is time, and then the y-axis is amplitude. This first peak is the direct sound hitting the microphone from the speaker, and then that gets cut off, and every spike that you see here over time comes from a reflective surface. And so when I get back to the office, I'm going to dig into it further, but we know the speed of sound is 1.13 feet per millisecond, and so if we know the time that it takes for this reflection to get back to the microphone, we can convert that to a distance and then figure out which surface in the room is the problem for each one of these spikes. So that's some fun I'll have when I get back to the office. We also look at waterfall plots. This is on the x-axis left to right would be frequency from 20 hertz up to 200 hertz. So we're just looking at the low end here. Up and down would be amplitude, and then kind of coming three-dimensionally out of the screen would be time. And so you can actually see which frequencies are lingering in the room longer than others, and usually this is due to a resonance or a room mode. So these ridges that you see at specific frequencies are going to be tied to a room mode issue most likely, and you see they extend longer than some of these other frequencies, and ideally you'd want them all to decay at a similar rate so that they fall off together. What ends up happening is these frequencies start to dominate and decay longer than everything else, and it clouds your judgment when it comes to mixing. So all these things we're going to be looking at and kind of putting a plan together to remedy it, and looking forward to making that happen. For a mixing position, you want it to be symmetrical because you want equal energy coming from your left and your right side. If you were to skew your mix position, push it off to one side, reflected energy off the left wall might be coming in quicker than what's coming off the right. But you want to be sitting symmetrically so you hear everything, and it helps with imaging and panning decisions. All of that is, it does cause issues in the frequency realm, because sitting right down the dead center of the room makes some of your peaks and dips more problematic, but that's what acoustical treatment's going to help fix.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So just I know you haven't had time to really look at anything, but at first glance, good sounding room, going to be a good room to put a studio in? Yeah, no, I think it's definitely usable. Like I was kind of mentioning to you off camera that I've seen some rooms that were actually treated that perform worse than this one. Obviously the echo and the reflection is something that we need to take care of. And there's some frequency issues, like we saw some front to back axial modes causing an issue around, I think it was around 37 hertz or so. I'll have to go back and look at the data. There's also a dip that was occurring that was caused by a tangential mode in the room, and that's where corner base trapping in the vertical corners is going to help. Mm-hmm. And then there was another side-to-side axial mode around 70 or so. Those seem to be the major things that popped out. And then of course there was comb filtering in the higher frequencies, because you have direct sound coming from the speakers hitting the microphone, and then you have all these reflections that are arriving within 50 milliseconds or so of the direct sound, and it creates a phase cancellation and all these sharp peaks and dips in the higher frequency range, and that'll get cleaned up very easily with spot treatment of absorption diffusion products. Right. Yeah. Right. So one question I've always wondered about is the floor surface. You go into many studios and they're a hardwood floor, and engineers will claim that sounds better. This is tile. Sure. So it's, is that good, bad? Is there one that's better than another? It's better than carpet. It's better than having carpet in here. The reason carpet is an uneven absorber. It absorbs higher frequencies really well, but it doesn't do hardly anything for the mids and highs. So it can create a kind of muddy and bass heavy sounding room. So a hard surface is better. Hardwood is preferred only because it just has a more warm and musical quality to it. I always tell people
it's similar to, like, imagine building an acoustic guitar out of whatever material your floor is made out of. You know, it's that warm musical tone that comes off of hardwoods. You know, natural hardwood's the best. Engineered hardwood would be next step down, and then, you know, laminates or artificial surfaces would be, you know, below that. I'd say I put tile like somewhere with some of those artificial surfaces. It's going to be a little bit more harsh sounding, but I know that you had a plan of maybe putting in an area rug, and that'll help calm things down. But definitely better to have a hard surface than a soft one.
Right, right. So anything in here that stands out as, wow, that's going to be difficult to treat with off-the-shelf kind of things, or are we going to be able to handle it all with that?
I think off-the-shelf treatments, I know that that's kind of the goal for this project, is just try to do something that everybody could do in their bedroom studios. You know, trying not to go overboard with a bunch of custom elements that would need to be constructed on site or tuned or anything like that. So we're going to try to use, you know, things that Sweetwater sells and the average person could potentially put in their space. It looks like most of the corners, this one over here is a little bit narrow, but I think we'll still be able to place a bass trap there. Most of the time in bedrooms, they always put the door right in the corner.
Right.
And so you can only bass trap 3 of the 4 corners, but in this room we should be able to do all 4, which is great. The window's centered in the room, which I like. You know, the back wall, we'll get a little creative with what we do by putting treatments on the back sides of the doors. But overall, we also talked about the curtain maybe for the window. That's something, you know, you have a wonderful view, like when you're just listening to things and it's not super critical, I'd just leave it open. But if we can do a thick, dense curtain over that window and oversize it so it has deep folds even when it's drawn to a close, then if it parts in the center, it'll actually gather in the corners, which happen to be right behind where the speakers are, which is going to help with speaker boundary interference response and do a little bit of bass trapping behind there.
Right.
So, yeah.
Nice, nice. So one last area to talk about is I've got this walk-in closet, and I want to use that either as a amp room for guitar amps, maybe go in there with an acoustic guitar, maybe do a vocal in there.
Yeah.
With a small space like that, it's what, 5 foot by 8 foot, something like that,
Yeah.
8 foot ceiling, something like that. Do you typically just fill that with as much treatment as you can fit in there, or is there more strategy to it?
Well, you mentioned acoustic guitar. You know, that is something that it'd be nice to have a little bit of liveliness left in the room. You know, it might be a situation where we try to deaden the lower half of the room where the amps are going to be, and then maybe do some sort of hybrid treatment up top. So I have some ideas. I just want to play around with it a little bit, but it'll be a nice sounding room when it's all done.
So it was very interesting to have Gavin come in and measure the room. So we had those before measurements that we could work with, and then we could compare those to the after measurements, as we'll see in the later in this video when we sit down with Gavin again. But let's take a tour around the room and see what's happening here. So the first thing I did is install the acoustic treatment based on the renderings that Gavin and Haverstick Designs had provided for me. They told me exactly where to place the acoustic treatment. So the things you've heard before. So we want to treat the first reflections. It's good to have a cloud overhead to treat that ceiling reflection. We wanted bass trapping in the corners to control some of the low frequencies. We've got a bit of diffusion on the back wall as well. A very handy tool for doing this is a laser tape measure, if you will, that allows you to very quickly get measurements of the room. But I also use laser levels to line up all the panels on the walls, and I used 3 of them to create a grid on the ceiling when I was putting in the clouds that hang overhead. To get the best performance from 2-inch thick panels like this, it's a good idea to actually offset them off the wall, and they make these offset impalers that allow you to space those away about 2 inches. What that does is lower the effective frequency of the panels, so you're getting coverage down into the lower mids and even some of the upper bass as well from these panels. So all the absorption panels that are mounted on the wall are spaced away from the wall using offset impalers, and not only does that improve their performance, but I think it also looks pretty cool as well, having that little bit of extra distance there, a little bit of depth behind the panels. On the back wall, I've got part science diffusers, and those break up the sound waves so we don't get direct reflections coming right back to the listening surface. We've got 4 of those strategically located according to Gavin's plan on the back wall. There's also 1 absorption panel there. There's a little bit of additional diffusion in the room from the pedal racks that are on the 2 sidewalls. I've got this pedal collection, wanted to be able to have quick access to it when I'm recording. I had seen a video where Tim Pierce was using an IKEA shoe rack to hold his pedals. Well, IKEA didn't have a rack like that anymore, but I found these metal racks on Wayfair or one of those catalog sites, and they work perfectly for holding my pedal collection, and it does provide just a little bit of extra diffusion in the back room as well. So that's some sort of unintended acoustic treatment. But the other acoustic treatment feature in the room are the clouds that hang overhead. I initially started out with just a cloud over the mix position here, and that helps to prevent reflections from coming off the ceiling back to the listening position. Now, one of the challenges with the cloud is how do you mount it onto the ceiling? There are different methods for doing that, but typically they result in a lot of holes in the ceiling, and as I mentioned, we move fairly frequently, so I didn't want to have a whole bunch of holes in this textured ceiling that I'd have to fix later. I searched around, tried to find different solutions, and my brilliant wife said, why don't you just use a curtain rod? Those panels are very lightweight, and there's really nothing pulling down on those curtain rods. You can mount it to the ceiling, which you do sometimes with curtains as well. Worked out perfectly, and then I used curtain rings with little clips to mount onto the back of each of these panels. Those are prime acoustic panels, and it works fantastically well. I've got to do a little bit more alignment there. Some of them are a little bit off of the straight. I want to get those lined up properly, so I've got to go up there and move those around a little bit, but it works fantastic. So I had the one cloud here over the mix position, which worked great, but I felt like the back, there was still a little bit too much going on back here, so I added a second one on the ceiling as well back here, and that's basically 8 foot by 4 foot, each of these clouds. They're spaced away about, I'd say they're 6-7 inches away from the ceiling, and that's going to help with some of our low frequency absorption as well. And those really made a huge difference in the room. Now the goal with all this was to use off-the-shelf treatments. I didn't want to do construction, I didn't want to build big bass traps, I didn't want to modify the room, I really just wanted to paint it and then install off-the-shelf treatments and get the room sounding as good as I could. So I had Gavin come back after we did the installation of everything and got it all set up. And we sat down to talk about the after results acoustically in the room. Gavin, welcome back.
Yeah.
It's been, what, about a year? Maybe
like
even a little bit more. So yeah, it was kind of slow getting things done. But
It always is with the studio. It's like it takes longer than you'd hope it to.
Yeah, but big difference, right?
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Like walking in here, we were talking off camera about how, I don't know, it's very comfortable and cozy and just feels creative, which is awesome.
Yeah, the room feels good to be in, and that's always kind of an interesting thing as you add the acoustic treatment. You can, if you overdo it,
Yeah.
it gets uncomfortable. If you don't do it enough, this room is so live.
Yes.
With the tile floor and all the hard surfaces and everything. You remember when we first came in here, it was like just a rattle box.
Yeah, no, it was untamed for sure.
Untamed.
Now, but it definitely feels like you said, it feels comfortable, but not overly dead. You know, something you could spend many hours in here. I'm sure you do.
And I do, yeah. It's a great place to hang out, and I can either open the curtain and have the view out, or if we're trying to be a little bit more acoustically appropriate.
Yes. No, that's great. That's a good addition, and yeah, you've just done an amazing job with. You know, we started off with doing some renderings of the space and kind of figuring out, after that first visit, we took acoustical measurements, and then we were designing treatment. And I know we had discussions about how you wanted to use more off-the-shelf items.
That's
and
right.
Make sure that it was something that wasn't super labor intensive, you know, as far as building your own custom bass traps and things like that.
Yeah, and just the fact that my wife and I are serial renovators, and we don't tend to stay a real long time in a house, and so I've done that before, where I've done the construction and then moved.
Right.
And that's kind of frustrating.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, I mean, what you've done, you have a combination of some panels from acoustical fulfillment. So you have the fulfill panels both on the walls, ceiling, and in the corners.
In the corners, yeah.
And then you also have the part science diffusers on the back wall.
Yep.
And
these are actually, the clouds are actually prime acoustic panels that
they are.
that I had left over from another studio that I had the last house that those are in. So
that's perfect.
The colors kind of match, so it all worked out. You know, you use what you have.
Yeah, exactly.
And then add to it from there.
Yeah, and we hit first reflection points in here. We stood the wall panels off of the wall a few inches with some offset impaling clips to get some extra low frequency absorption out of them. The corner panels have a nice air gap behind them as well. Ceiling clouds hung down. It's just like kind of making the most out of off-the-shelf treatment, because sometimes it's limited because of how big you'd want those bass traps to normally be. Like, it's not uncommon for us to do 3 foot thick bass traps in the corners if we're building custom. But in this case, you know, I think you did a really good job with it. Yeah,
and that's a trade-off, right? I mean, this isn't a huge room. It's a good-sized room for a bedroom.
Yeah.
And it's plenty of space for what I need to do in here. But if we had taken 3 feet to do a bass trap or whatever, it would start to kind
Get
of
a little
squeeze
cramped.
things. Yeah, get a little more claustrophobic. One of the cool things is you did measurements of basically the empty room,
Right.
with just a pair of speakers in it. I think was all it was in here at that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, that was it.
And now today you have taken, those were before, and now let's talk about the after measurements that you did.
So we set up a microphone at the mix position. We'll preface it with the fact that it's a different set of speakers than we had before.
Yes.
Before it was Focal, and now you have the Neumann. But it's same mix position, and we took measurements with the left speaker only, right speaker only, then both of them together, just to see the differences. And the beauty of it is that when we're comparing the before and after, what we're looking for is changes in the frequency response that are positive. Also impulse responses, so like reflections in the room and how it's coming back to the listening position. And what we saw is kind of what we expected to happen was that below 100 hertz there's not a whole lot of change. There's slight changes, but it's just the types of treatment that we used in the room wasn't focused on that frequency range. It was more so mid-range and high frequencies. Especially high frequencies, there was a lot of comb filtering in the before results.
The untreated room, the reflections.
It's just like reflections coming back slightly delayed from the direct sound. It creates these sharp peaks and dips in the frequency response, and that's been lessened greatly. I mean, it's and you see that also in the impulse responses, because we saw a ton of spikes coming back delayed after the direct sound in the before, and now it's just a few things here and there.
Right.
And so that has been really good. Some of the issues that we're seeing below 100 hertz, like I can tie those back to axial or tangential modes that we just didn't treat. Like there were some things that we were thinking about doing, like a soffit bass trap around the room and some thicker treatment in different areas, but we just kind of pivoted with what your goals were for the room.
Yeah.
And I think it, for what we've got going on, it's a great starting point for. I know that you also use some like kind of room correction software in here.
Yeah, which has been interesting to. I've looked at SonarWorks, and I've got the Arc Studio here as well from IK Multimedia, and we were talking earlier. The goal was kind of to get the acoustics 80% of the way there, and then just fine tune the rest of it with a little bit. And as you said, it's tough with off-the-shelf stuff to really address like that. I think there was a dip at 38 hertz and one at 50, and that's getting down there.
We're just not going to touch it.
Yeah, down there pretty low. And we were also talking that there's a subwoofer with the Neumann monitors, the KH750, and the placement of that makes a big difference in how much you activate those different modes.
It really does. And in the testing that we did today to simulate what we did before, there was no subwoofer before, so we just only did left and right speakers today as well for comparison's sake. But that subwoofer can, depending on placement and the settings that you put on it, can really impact that range we're just talking about and bring some of those dips up and some of those peaks down to get a more consistent response. So that's a fun exercise. I know you've spent a lot of time doing that.
I did. I've had a couple different subwoofers in there, and interestingly, the sub ended up kind of centered on the wall, which normally you think of like a quarter of the way along or a third of the way or something like that. But and it's also spaced a little bit away from the wall. I think that made a difference also in kind of evening out that bottom end.
Yeah, definitely can. It's pretty wild how much of a change. We've talked before about the subwoofer crawl method, where you can place the sub at your mix position and then crawl around and listen to places where the sub sounds consistent. Put your ears where the sub could go, and then when you swap them, it translates. And so that's a good exercise that people can use, like even if they're not testing and doing measurements like you are. You could at least get the subjective side of things dialed in and mess with the settings and phase and low frequency cutoff and all those things make a difference. And
certainly.
So yeah, that below 100 hertz range with the subwoofer will be a lot more consistent.
Yeah, and then just tweaking it a little bit with SonarWorks or Arc Studio lets you kind of dial that in. When I did the analysis with those, and I'm curious if it translates to what you did with your software. I was seeing those like two dips, one at like 50 hertz and one at like 100.
That
were pretty prominent. But then also sort of a bit of a peak, about 4.5 dB up, which isn't bad. At in the 200 hertz. Kind of range.
And that's what I was seeing as well. That those software programs, they're using an omnidirectional measurement microphone, just like I am, and is measuring things really well. Usually their readouts show a little bit more of a smooth response than I'm looking at it unsmooth, so I can see all the fine-tuned details. But from what you showed me earlier, yeah, it's pretty much similar to what I got, which allows them to make some adjustments. And especially in that range, in that 200 to 300 hertz range, that's where we saw the biggest difference in just cutting it a little bit. And before, it actually, in the before measurements, it was a little bit more of a dip in that range. And so having the treatment in here, there's less cancellation that's going on, but then the software can bring it down even further to be more consistent with the mids and highs.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. And then we also have, there's going to be some reflections off the desk and different things going on with all of this stuff that we have to have too, that I'm sure, in my experience in the past, that's really been that kind of range where that's been that reflecting kind of thing going on.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things, and that's compromises in a room. We were talking earlier about when I did the left versus right speaker, there was one reflection that showed up in the left speaker that didn't in the right, and it just happens to be a piece of artwork that's on the back wall, where on the right side of the room it's a panel, on the left side of the room it was a piece of art. So now it wasn't something that made a drastic difference in the room, but it was something that piqued my interest.
It is interesting, how detailed you can get with those measurements and those analysis. So when you then look at a room like this and the treatment that we've done, a couple of things that I'm curious about. One, is there something we could do in addition to what we've got here that would address that 200, 300 hertz kind of a peak?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, most of these panels that are in here, they're decent around 250 hertz, but if they were even thicker, that's something that's going to help with that range.
Okay.
Also, there's a lot of tangential modes that are happening in that range. And we've trapped the vertical corners in here, and that does a good job. I would say that these traps would work well in the 200 to 300 hertz range. But there's also tangential modes going in different directions in the room where soffit trapping, like we were talking about before, would help. And so what we've done so far is trap one of the three types of tangential modes by doing vertical corners.
Okay.
But if you did the horizontal corners around the room, that would make a difference.
So that'd be like the ceiling to wall corners, and then what is the third one?
Well, that would be a ceiling wall on the side walls and ceiling wall on the front and back walls, too.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, which isn't going to work real well in here. You would,
there's
with
a lot
the window, it's kind of tough to do that. But yeah, you could do that on the sidewalls, I guess.
Definitely. Especially, and you could only do it at near the mix position. Like I know you have the racks in the back that go pretty high. You could do it just in that first, 2/3 of the room and make a big difference.
The other thing that stuck out at me when you provided the renderings and we talked about the design for the room is there's actually less treatment than I probably would have done in here. I probably would have done like a solid wall of panels on each side at least, and maybe more in the back.
Yeah, I know when we talked, one conversation we had a lot was just we don't want it to sound so dead in here. And so by spacing out the treatment, still hitting those first reflection points, but there's maybe a 6 to 8 inch gap in between the panels there. And for the most part, especially with the panels spaced off away from the wall, if it were to hit that little section that's untreated, it's going to hit kind of the back of the panel, kind of skip off of it, and still be absorbed. And so, I think it's a good combination of having. I always like to do that testing beforehand because you can actually figure out where the important spots to put panels are. Because the last thing I like to see is you walk in a room and it's 100% covered.
Right.
While some of our rooms that we do custom are stretched fabric and you see only fabric, it doesn't mean there's always treatment behind that fabric. If you tore away the fabric, sometimes there's empty spaces or diffusers in certain spots. And so I really don't like to blanket it completely because especially with off-the-shelf items, they're really good at absorbing mid and high frequencies, but not as good in the lows. And so if you overdo it in the highs, you get rooms that start to sound really boxy and boomy. And so we wanted to make sure that it was somewhat balanced.
Right.
Yeah. And even like these guitar pedals shelving that you have in the back of the room, those are actually diffusers in a way. Maybe they're not mathematical or geometrical diffusers, but they scatter sound. So
I had some leftover, they're 12 by 12, 1 inch thick panels. And so the top few shelves actually have those on there.
Oh, yeah.
And I could actually hear the difference.
Sure.
It's surprising that what that does just to absorb some of that extra rattle and ambience that's in the back.
For sure.
So we talked a little bit about how the racks of pedals can serve as diffusion, and I've got a little bit of some panels at the top of that or whatever. But talk a little bit about what difference it makes having a desk like this and the racks of guitars, and there's a chair in the back that has a big cushion on it and stuff.
Yeah, when I was here the first time, it was an empty room, and the testing was done with no furniture. But everything does make a difference, like some of them more than others. You know, like if you were to have a big couch in the back of the room, this is a pretty padded chair, you know, that adds absorption to the room. You know, a couch on the back wall is sometimes nice. We can't do it in here because that's where the door is.
Right.
But that does help with some tangential mode absorption because while the soffit trapping around the ceiling wall junctures, it also would be effective at the floor wall junctures too.
Sure.
So couches there can be nice. The desk itself could be a challenge. It's one of those necessary evils to have something there. You know, you do see some trending for mastering engineers have a really small desk, and there's a reason for that is that there's just less of an acoustic footprint with that because it can cause some issues depending on how the desk is made and its sizing, and then there's usually a cavity underneath it for your legs to be able to roll into, and that can be a resonant chamber as well. I've even seen some desks that have like the studio we did for David Crowder, it was a custom desk that was built before we got involved, and it was pretty resonant under there, and the subs were right behind it, and it set that cavity in motion, so we had to do things to take care of it. But yeah, everything does make a difference. You know, I usually try to keep reflective surfaces below ear level if possible. So like you see rack gear, sometimes there'll be 6-7 foot tall rack gear pieces that are really close to your mix position. Those will show up in these impulse response graphs as well, and can be a source of reflection just like anything else.
Yeah, so trying to keep everything down low, and I like the low roller racks where things are almost face up.
Yes.
For some of that stuff. And another thing that I found in the past is putting speakers on the desk. Can really make a big difference. So you want to be sure to isolate those. These are on stands. Well, the bigger speakers are on stands. The small ones are on the lighter stands. But I've heard that ringing.
It can, yeah. I mean, these speaker manufacturers, they're designing speakers and testing them in anechoic chambers where they're suspended in the middle of the room by springs. And, you know, it's something where they're taking the room out of the equation when they're doing all their design specs on it. But then they never know exactly how it's going to be put into a room, and everything will change it. So isolating it, you know, getting them up off the desk so there's not just a quick reflection off the desk, all those things matter.
Right, yeah. And I tried to keep things away from the tweeter is always my approach, is to try to not block that with anything that might be going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's always tell people, I mean, we've got a lot of monitors like screens and things that we need to place in certain spots, and sometimes it's a issue with Atmos rooms where they have a center channel and plus you have screens, and so kind of a basic rule of thumb is that you want to avoid those tweeters as much as possible, blocking them. But if you got visual sight lines to them, then you're usually doing pretty
good shape.
Yeah.
And I've always tried to put the computer monitor a little bit behind the speakers as much as possible too, so that you're not getting at a surface there that it's working off of.
Oh, for sure. I mean, because you can get diffraction around that speaker, around that screen itself, and it can cause problems. Everything can cause problems, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It makes it difficult. But
well, like you said, it's all a big compromise.
Yeah.
Kind of with everything that you're doing, but once again, we talked a little bit about some of the changes I heard as we did different things. But bringing in that chair was audible, and once the desk got loaded up and everything was put in here, and the guitar racks came in and things. One thing that I've noticed also you have to be careful of is the guitars will resonate and ring, and you almost get a reverb effect. So like all my acoustics have mutes on the strings.
All that's really important, especially if you're, because those are all things that you could end up learning it, but why? Why do that if you can get away with just muting them?
Yeah, make the room as good as you can. And I think that's kind of the big takeaway here is, assuming you're not going to do construction, you're not going to do major work on the room or build from the ground up, which would be the ideal.
Sure.
Then do the best you can with the acoustic treatment, and then these
room correction stuff.
Thank you. Room correction software and hardware really makes a big difference.
It does.
Just because it tweaks that last little bit.
Yeah, and the nice thing about that is that some people will think that if I have that software, I don't need to treat my room. It doesn't really work that way. I mean, you want that software to do the littlest amount of work possible. You know, and if you take care of first reflection points and the low end as best you can with the means that you have, then that's going to be that final touch to take it to the next level.
Because that software can't do anything in the time domain.
Right.
It's not going to do anything with delay times and with ambience and any any of the measurements that you do on that stuff, it's really going to only work in the frequency level, level at those different frequencies, and at the spot where basically you're sitting.
Right.
Is the the other part of that.
Exactly.
But that's where you work.
That's where you work. I mean, if you're got a project studio at home and it's mostly you working, that's great. Now, if you have clients come over and they're sitting on that couch on the back wall, or they're over your shoulder a few feet back, they're going to get a different experience, for sure. And it's important to know that that's the difference. And when we're designing rooms from scratch, a lot of times, if there's a producer desk where we think the client's going to be, a lot of times we'll design things around it as well. We talked about 38% point for your mix position. When we design from scratch, we'll have a 38% point in the back of the room from the back wall, and that more closely represents what's going on here.
Sure. And the room correction software, some of them will allow you to have multiple scenes, so you could switch to, you're going to listen back there, so we'll change it to this correction to work better in that part of the room. So
absolutely,
lots of things you can do, but between the two, between the room correction and between the acoustic treatment, you really can come up with a great sounding room.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is there's a lot of people that would love to have this in their basement.
Well, it is fantastic, and it's really been fun to listen to music and to hear things in here.
That's awesome.
And I think the biggest difference I heard in here was when I put the second actual cloud up.
Oh, right.
So there was the one over the mix position, which made a big difference, and you kind of create this zone, but drying that up a little bit in the back with that second cloud really made an audible difference in here.
Oh, I bet. Yeah, I mean, and two, with there being diffusers on the back wall, that's receiving a lot of the brunt of the energy from the speakers. They're facing that direction, and it's going to help scatter sound and make the room sound more full, and not like you have to feel like your head's in a vice at the mix position.
Right.
You can move around a little bit and still get a good response. But that second cloud, it really helps with the skip that comes off of that, hits those diffusers again, and so I think that everything. I think you've done exactly what most people should do in bedroom studios. Like unless they want to go all out and do a bunch of custom work. I mean, this is a really good treatment package you've done in here.
Yeah, just being able to order things from Sweetwater, and put them up, and I do really recommend the offset impalers.
Yeah,
I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah,
I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but there's just no energy right against the wall, and so when you put things flat against the wall, they're not as effective.
Exactly.
as
because these things are. It does a couple things. It helps with the performance of the panel, and also I think visually it helps too.
It looks cool.
Right? It looks nice to have a little bit of shadow that goes on. And I like the elements you've added, like the lights in the corners.
Thank you.
All those things matter, because you're spending a lot of time in here and you want to be inspired and creative. It's important. Like even the paint color you chose, it's just a really
My wife did that. She's the designer.
Nice.
So
Well, thumbs up.
Give her the credit for the decor and the rugs and everything else is her doing. So I won't take any credit for that.
That's perfect.
The one thing I haven't completed yet is the acoustic treatment in the closet, which will be the amp room. You walk past the pile of panels that I've still got in the hallway.
The best sounding hallway in the house, I think.
But that'll be also I'll be doing that, and you had given me a plan for that as well to sort of create a space where I can have a speaker cabinet and record things as well. So it's super exciting to have the room together. I appreciate your help so much.
Of course, it was fun to be a part of it, and thanks for calling me to get involved.
Absolutely. So that's the acoustic side of the equation. The other side of the equation, of course, is the gear. I already talked about my pedal collection on the two shelves. I've got my guitars and guitar racks here, so they're all instantly accessible. There's a bass there, my acoustics, a variety of different electrics, and so on. And I've also got 3 amp heads here in a rack. I've got the Universal Audio aux on top, so I can run those silent and route them directly into my DAW. But I also have a closet here on the back wall. And if we open that up, it's a good-sized closet. And I haven't treated it yet acoustically. So that closet is plenty deep enough, plenty big enough to both have storage in there, as well as set up a speaker cabinet with a microphone on it that I can then use to record my amp straight into the DAW. It should work great. So now let's circle around to the desk and all of the gear that I'm using here. I'm really happy with the way this gear has come together. It's been working very, very well for me. So the whole thing is based around a MacBook Pro. I run Pro Tools or Studio One are my 2 DAWs that I work with. I also use Sibelius for notation. And I'm using the 3 SSL controllers, the UF8, the UF1, and the UC1, which are just fantastic for getting hands-on with your mixes. I'm really enjoying having those. I found this frame or console, a guy in the Czech Republic makes those, and so I ordered that and waited a few months for it to get through customs and everything, but it's just beautiful. I love it. It's got the armrest on the front and makes it feel like you're actually working on a real console which when you work with the whole 360 system with SSL's controllers, it basically is like working on an SSL console. So that's very cool. I've really been enjoying that. Now, in addition to the control surfaces, I also have my iPad set up with, right now it's running Studio One remote control that allows me to both see meters, but I can also start stop. You can do a variety of remote control things. You can access inserts, you can access sends, QMix, and so on. So I find that really useful to be able to very quickly reach over and either see what's happening or to access a command or something that I need to work on. With Pro Tools, we have all types of soft keys and things that allow us to access functions inside of Pro Tools. So I found this very useful. I've also got a remote program that allows me to control note selection and things in Sibelius when I'm working on notation. So this iPad gets used a lot. And when I'm not using it for remote control purposes, I can play a movie while I'm working or a TV show or something like that. So handy little benefit there. I've also got control surfaces for the TC Electronic plugins. And again, I've got those mounted into a cool walnut console that I think looks great. I'm using an ultra wide monitor. I've got two sets of monitor speakers. My main speakers are KH310s from Neumann, and underneath the desk I've also got a KH750 subwoofer. My alternate, or my second set of speakers, are these Genelecs, and it's the smallest Genelecs that they make. I believe those are the 8010s, and they work great as a secondary reference. Now, as you heard when we were talking with Gavin about the acoustics in the room, the acoustics in an off-the-shelf type situation like this got me about 80% of where I really wanted to be with fine-tuning the room. For the remainder, I'm working with Arc Studio from IK Multimedia, and I've actually got two of those. They're down here in the bottom of the rack. Now, I've got one of those that's assigned to the Neumann system. I've got one of those that's assigned to the Genelec system. I can bypass them, and then when I switch my monitors on the front panel of the Apollo interface that I'm using, I can pop instantly from between the two sets of monitors, and the two room correction devices roll right along with it. So we have the proper correction with each one of our monitors, which is very cool. Speaking of the racks, I've got my Apollo 8 over here. I've got a 1073 mic preamp. I've got some of the R&D preamps as well, the 5025, which is a dual Shelford, and I've got the Shelford channel also, just beautiful preamps. I love having those extra preamps to use in addition to the clean preamps that are in the Apollo. Now, the 1073 from Neve is actually routing through the Burl converter. So that gives it more of that actual console sound. You got the transformers on the mic inputs and outputs on the Neve, and then it's going through the Burl, which also has transformers, and so we're getting a lot of flavor from that, and you can dial in the amount of flavor you want. So I really enjoy that. And of course, the versatility of the R&D Shelford gear, fantastic. You can go from ultra clean to nice and chewy and thick as well. So lots of options there. A fun option is I've got a Benson Echo Rec, and it's on a rolling shelf here, and it's patched into an input and an output on the Apollo, so I can instantly send a signal through that rotating drum delay and get a true vintage echo applied to any of my tracks that I want. So I really love having that, and having it on a shelf makes it very easy to access. At the bottom of the rack, I have a patch panel that allows me to access all of the microphone inputs, so I don't have to be digging around behind the rack to be plugging everything in. Right now, I've got two channels coming in from the stereo outputs for my pedal board. Typically, that's sitting there for practice, for working on tunes, for writing, and so on. And so I just leave that connected to the first two inputs on the Apollo. And then these other inputs access the inputs to the rack preamps as well. One very cool feature on this side of the rack, you can never have enough desk space. And as you can see, I've filled up the desk space pretty well here already. So I put another sliding shelf here at the top. I can pull that out, and it gives me just a little bit more work area to be able to have a piece of paper, a notebook, or a beverage, or whatever you might want to have next to you while you're working. So I love having that there. I find that's a great ergonomic feature to have in the desk. On the other side of the rack, I got my master power switch here, which turns everything on and off. I've got a single space rack drawer, and this holds a screwdriver, a tape measure, a coaster for a drink. I've got a spare hard drive in there. I've got a couple of screwdrivers. So those kind of things that you just reach for all the time. There's guitar picks in here, a nail file for a guitar player. You got to have a nail file. So those kind of things are in that top drawer. The next two pieces are on the master bus when I'm mixing. And so I've got the Bax EQ from Dangerous Music. Love that EQ. It's a nice shaping EQ for the high end and the low end. And then I've got the Dangerous Master that allows me to bring that in and out. And I've actually got two open slots on that. So I'll probably be adding a compressor and who knows, maybe something else there as well that you can use with the Dangerous Master to have on the mix bus chain on the output. I've got two more rack drawers there that hold, the top one has guitar gear, cables, power supply, things so I can just quickly plug in my guitar stuff when I need to. And the second drawer is some microphone cable, a booster for low-level microphones going into the Apollo. Some of that kind of stuff that you use all the time, I wanted to have it right here in the rack, ready to be accessed at any time. At the bottom of this rack, I have my 2 ARC Studios from IK Multimedia. I've also got 2 hard drives there, and those are studio essentials. One is a 4 terabyte, just regular hard drive that I use for quick drag backup, and the other is a 20 terabyte RAID that I use for more permanent archiving of my projects and things. So highly recommend making a space for having those kind of things in your racks. In the middle, I've got a universal audio satellite, and that powers my UAD plugins for me. Now, this desk was made for me by RAB or RAB Audio, and they included some very cool features. So first of all, it's spaced for me, so it's comfortable. The height is comfortable for me. It's got enough rack space. We made the desktop kind of shaped a little bit, so it works very well. But there's some really cool features, like there's a channel in the back that allows you to route cables between the two. If you look underneath, there's really no cables visible on the back of the rack, and that's because of that channel that lets that run. But an even better feature is on the back of each rack, there are 4 rack rail spaces there. And so I've got 2 power strips mounted in each side, and I've got a USB hub mounted in there as well. And so that allows me to take all of that stuff and have it out of sight and on the back of the rack, but still accessible. And I find that's just a great convenience feature to have those extra rack rails on the back of the rack as well. So very cool desk. I'm really happy with it. Rounding things out, I've got a CME keyboard for, I mainly use that when I'm working on notation because it's right in front of me. I can be working on the computer, selecting rhythmic values and things here and playing the parts in using this little keyboard, or just for putting quick parts in. I find this is fantastic, and it's out of the way when I'm not using it. And then I've got a Native Instruments Control S61 that I use with Complete and with some of my other virtual instruments as well, so like having that control surface there. Other than that, I've got a selection of microphones. I mainly am oriented toward recording guitar here, so I've got some DPA 2011Cs that I use for acoustic guitar as well as for electric guitar. Of course, you have to have a Royer ribbon microphone and Shure SM57 for recording electric guitar cabinets. So I've got 2 sets of those so I can record in stereo. I've got some Mojave MA200s for vocals and a variety of other mics as well so that I use for different purposes. So the selection of those is stored in the closet in there, in the cabinet and on the rack. There's also cables in there. So I try to keep it as neat and as organized as possible, but also make it so everything is very instantly accessible. I don't want to be having to interrupt the creative flow to search for something. So I try to be very organized with all that stuff. And again, having things that I use all the time in the drawers, in the rack, I just find that makes it so much better for keeping your focus on the music and on creativity as opposed to looking for things. So that's a good tip for you. Another tip for you, if you use an electric screwdriver to put the screws into your rack, do the last 5% or so of the tightening the screw down with a screwdriver. I put some in with a electric screwdriver and they lodged in there so tight that I actually had to drill them out to get them out of there. So something to, you can learn from my mistake there and not tighten those rack screws too tight. So a variety of little tips that you pick up along the way that can make your creative flow better, whether it's using the iPad for remote control, control surfaces, instant access to things, having things set up so that you can very quickly plug into them either directly or mic them up, having your microphones and things very accessible. All that will lead to more ergonomic, more fulfilling, and more just efficient sessions as you're trying to be creative in your studio. I hope you've enjoyed this look at my home studio. It's been a lot of fun putting it together, and I'm having even more fun working in it. I'm already at work on my next project here. Got some things going. I'm super excited to continue using the studio and to continue seeing how it evolves. Studios are never finished. They're just sort of in progress for their whole life. Hopefully you've picked up a few tips here about acoustic treatment and how well you really can acoustically treat a room using off-the-shelf treatments from Sweetwater. Head over to sweetwater.com to check out all the acoustic treatments as well as all the gear that you see here in this studio. If you have any questions about anything that you've seen here, as I mentioned, sweetwater.com is a great resource, but give your Sweetwater sales engineer a call. They can help you out with any of the equipment that we've looked at, any of the acoustic treatments, some of the studio design things, the software, all of that is instantly available to you with the best resource that's available to you, which is your Sweetwater sales engineer. But wait, there's more. You remember just a second ago I mentioned how home studios are never really finished. They're just always works in progress. Well, that's certainly the case with my studio as well, and I've made some changes since we shot the initial video. Let's check out what's going on here. First First up, you'll remember that I had those wire shoe racks that I was using to hold my pedal collection, and they were, to say the least, just a little bit flimsy. They just weren't quite stout enough to stand up to all the weight of those pedals. What happened is, Bob Bloss from RAB Audio was bringing over the desk that I installed here in the studio, and we got to talking about studio storage solutions and pedal collections and amplifiers and things, and the germ of an idea came out for making some new pedal racks as well as amp racks. Now I've got 2 of these new pedal racks here in my studio. I've replaced those wire shoe racks with the pedal racks, and they're working great. What's great about these is that they're actually modular. You can change the angle of the shelves, you can add additional shelves if you don't want them quite so far apart, you can add additional items on the sides, you can join them together. Lots you can do here, but they're working great for my pedal collection. Now I've got a similar rack that we came up with for amplifiers, and the cool thing about this is not only does it have shelves to hold the amps, and they're sturdy enough to hold heavy amps, you can add more shelves, you can move them up and down. There's also rack spaces at the top, and then I have my Synergy system installed there, so I've got 2 of my modules installed in the single space preamp rack, and then I've got the stereo tube power amplifier for recording stereo in my amp closet, and there's also a storage space on the left as well. Now once again, this is expandable. You can add shelves, you can add additional things on the sides, you can connect them together. So it's a great system and I'm really enjoying it. One thing I did notice is that when I had the rack set up where the original wire rack that was holding my amplifiers was, it was kind of blocking the acoustic treatment. So I shifted that back so that the treatment at the first reflection point would be more effective. I basically swapped the position of the guitar rack with the amp rack, and it's working out great. Another change is I've added a couple of new instruments to the studio. I've got 2 keyboards now, and I specifically chose these keyboards. It's a Chord Op6 as well as an Oberheim OB6 because I wanted instruments that I'd play. I didn't necessarily want something to try to replace what I already had in a virtual instrument in the computer. Those were all great and I use them all the time. What I wanted is things that I could actually play as instruments, and these 2 really jumped out at me with the sounds that I need for the music that I make. So the point is, studios are always evolving, and in fact I'm considering a 3rd keyboard. I'm looking at whether or not I need acoustic treatment above those pedal racks. I'll need to talk to Gavin Haverstick about that and get the lowdown on whether that should be diffusion or whether it should be absorption. So things are always in flux, and that's the fun part about having a studio. Once again, if you have questions about any of the gear you've seen in this video, questions about how to put your studio together, about acoustics, any of those kind of things, contact your Sweetwater sales engineer. They'll be happy to help you out.